Chapter 19. Achilles' heel. Power was the first thing that went wrong with the CIA. There was too much of it, and it was too easy to bring to bear. Tom Braden, by the late 1950s, the CIA had come to see Encounter as its standard, agreeing with Joselson's assessment of the magazine as our greatest asset. In agency speak, an asset was any resource at the disposition of the agency for use in an operational or support role. The agency's operational principle, as established by Tom Braden, dictated that organizations receiving its support should not be required to support every aspect of official American policy. This meant that a leftish agenda could survive in an organ like Encounter. But whilst it was left-wing in the sense that it gave expression to some left-wing views, it wasn't a free forum at all, which it purported to be, according to British philosopher Richard Wollheim. I think the effect of it was to give the impression that it was the whole spectrum of opinion they were publishing. But invariably, they were cutting it off at a certain point, notably where it concerned areas of American foreign policy. It was skillfully done. There were opinions that were published in criticism of America, but it was never really critical. And this, according to Tom Braden, is how Encounter was expected to perform. It was propaganda in the sense that it did not often deviate from what the State Department would say U.S. foreign policy was. When Braden offered a degree of laxity, he certainly didn't intend that Encounter should be free to denounce any or every aspect of official American policy. And this, in 1958, is precisely what it was set to do. Early that year, Dwight MacDonald resurfaced in New York after his tenure at Encounter. To break the journey, he had stopped for 2 months in Tuscany, where he was overwhelmed with a sense of the fecundity of European tradition. Back in New York, where taxi drivers swore and public manners were atrocious, he suffered a serious case of culture shock. He sat down to write about his feelings of revulsion at the violence, the tawdriness, the shapelessness of America, a country without style, without a sense of past or present, bent on extracting the greatest amount of lucre. The national motto should be not e pluribus unum, not in God we trust, but I got mine and screw you, Jack, he asserted angrily. What MacDonald wrote was a protracted lament for a country which he saw as already in decline. With so many intellectuals streaming across the threshold to embrace American culture, Dwight the Maverick rediscovered an urge to strike a posture against the American grain. In January, he sent his thoughts to Encounter in an article entitled simply, America, America. Spender accepted it, without, he later claimed, reading it through properly. But Irving Kristol was appalled. He found it John Osborne-ish, unhealthily self-lacerating, poorly constructed. Dwight was a wonderful journalist, but utterly unpredictable and sometimes capable of being quite silly, he said, adding that because Dwight came from a privileged background, he knew nothing about America, and the same impediment prevented him from understanding England, to which America was so disadvantageously compared in his piece. He knew nothing about England. He never went to a football game in England. He never went to a rugby game in England. His knowledge of England was from the various clubs in the St. James's area. He was a hick. He said Grosvenor Square, for God's sake. This, from a man who had taken to wearing a bowler hat and carrying an umbrella on his way to work, was strong stuff. Lasky, too, thought it was a very poor article, and echoed Kristol's claim that MacDonald knew nothing about the real America because he was a Yale man and a Greenwich Village man, and that's about what he knew. And when he came over to England, he had all the cliched positions of an innocent Mark Twain American abroad. He loved everything British. He loved the pubs, and he loved the names of the streets and the squares and everything. We were embarrassed. Americans could be so naive and at such a low level. It was a terrible article. I told Mike Joselson at the time that Dwight was the Achilles heel of the Congress, and I was right, Lasky concluded smugly. But MacDonald's sin was far greater than his mispronunciation of Grosvenor Square. As a critique of contemporary America, the article certainly had its weaknesses. As the exclamatory nature of its title made clear, it was an instinctual, rather than a seriously argued rebuttal of American values. It compared America with England and Italy in a way which demonstrated a romantic weakness in MacDonald for idealizing foreign cultures. Yet it was also an extraordinarily apposite piece, exploiting a wealth of data and recent research, touching on just about every area of American life which was of concern to its publicists. As MacDonald set about knocking every sacred cow, it was uncanny, as if he had read somewhere a hit list of all the negative stereotypes which American covert operators were bent on eradicating. He denounced rampant materialism unmatched by any spiritual growth, violent crime, the unhindered advance of advertising billboards, the lack of discrimination amidst literary critics, the prevalence of racial discrimination. He attacked John Foster Dulles as the pious, artful dodger, the perfect prototype of America's grossness and hypocrisy, Henry Luce as a Boy Scout acting like a gangster, Vice President Nixon for his gauche behavior in Venezuela, for which he had been deservedly, chronically mobbed, President Eisenhower for being a gunslinging reactionary, George Walker, Vice President of Ford Motors, for acting like an Eastern potentate, the American labor unions for being more interested in public relations than the class struggle, and their leaders David Dubinsky and Walter Reuther for being so damned virtuous. On went this catalog of contemporary American sins, MacDonald's animosity towards the decadent American imperium taking him to new depths of disgust. When one hears Europeans complaining about the Americanization of Europe, one wishes they could spend a few weeks over here and get a load of the real thing. Even the Soviet Russians, for all their ruthlessness, barely covered by the fig of ideology, seem to speak a more common language with other peoples than we do. Despite finding the piece utterly ridiculous, Kristall agreed to run it, claiming he had no choice given Stevens' acceptance. No sooner was it accepted than the Paris Bureau got hold of a copy. Spender and Kristall were instantly urged not to run it, and warned that Junkie Fleischman had said it would hurt the Congress and jeopardize its funding. I was easily moved not to run it, since I hadn't liked it in the first place, Kristall later claimed. Stephen was a little more recalcitrant, but in the end we said to the Paris office, if it's really going to make life that much more difficult for you, we can do without the article. And then Dwight published it elsewhere, complaining about censorship. Rejecting an article is not censorship. I've been an editor of magazines all my life, and I've rejected plenty of articles, and I've never regarded that as a form of censorship. It fell to Spender to tell MacDonald that they would not be able to run the piece without considerable alterations. Having reread the article, Spender said he felt it was one-sided and too critical. He added that Nabokov had read the article and had become very upset. MacDonald was furious to learn that General Secretary and Grand Master of International Decorum, Nicholas Nabokov, had been providing the editors of Encounter with advice and suggested to Stephen Irving, Nicholas Mike, or whoever's around and decides things, that from now on the editors simply consult the Paris office at once on receipt of a controversial MS so as to find out immediately what it thinks. As it happens, this was precisely what the editors were doing. With MacDonald refusing to take on board any cuts, the piece was finally axed. It had been accepted, rejected, accepted, rejected. I feel badly about it, said Spender in an interview shortly before his death. That's the only article that was not published in Encounter as a result of very strong pressure being brought on us by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It's absolutely the only article. When there was trouble about it, I thought it was a rather foolish kind of article. And I thought that probably if I had looked at it, I would either have wanted to alter it or I would have rejected it. Now, looking back on it, this is the one thing that I regret very much, because I think even if having looked at the article I didn't like it, I still should have insisted, made a point on which one resigns, that we published this article because we had accepted it. And the only reason for rejecting it was its anti-Americanism. 14. But it wasn't just the Paris office that intervened. According to Diana Josselson, who thought that the whole article was very désabusé, this was the one example of editorial intervention by the CIA, and Michael fought it very hard, but he didn't win. 15. How did the agency come by the article in the first place? If, as the orthodoxy upheld by those involved goes, Congress publications were not previewed by the agency, how did news of the McDonald piece reach them? Josselson was receiving advance copies of ProAvs, and at least the table contents of Encounter. But surely it was not in his interest to pass this fiery piece on to his superiors in Washington? Josselson always preferred to deal with problems independently of the agency, whose affiliation with the Congress he came increasingly to resent. There is no doubt, however, that America, did the rounds in the corridors of Washington. Most probably, the article arrived there via the CIA's case officer in the Congress, who was, at that time, Lee Williams. If the only thing wrong with the piece was its submission to cheap anti-Americanism, why did the agency jeopardize the credibility of Encounter, its greatest asset, in an effort to suppress it? Surely here was a great opportunity to demonstrate Encounter's bona fides, to erode the view that it was uncritical of American failures, to rebalance the acoustics which, said some critics, had always sounded odd? More to the point, if the article was as ridiculous as everyone claimed, then what possible damage could it do to anyone other than its author? Contrary to what Diana Josselson later remembered, Josselson was in fact against running the offending article from the beginning. He called it the most blatantly anti-American piece I have ever read, and said it belonged in Literaturnaya Gazeta. 16, he knew that McDonald will probably raise a stink and attack us publicly, but I am ready to face it. His fingerprints were all over the decision to axe it. Running it would have done considerable harm to Encounter's reputation in Washington, and it would also have made Josselson look nothing short of a renegade. His own credibility was on the line, Pot 17. For those hardened clandestine operators who viewed the International Organizations Division as a bit of fluff on the side, who sneered at the idea of aiding and abetting people or organizations who were supposed to be friends or have the same point of view, the McDonald flap was a vindication. Richard Helms, Wisner's deputy and later CIA director, gave voice to this skepticism when he told a select committee that the clandestine operator is trained to believe that you really can't count on the honesty of your agent to do exactly what you want or to report accurately unless you own him body and soul. 18. That anybody in the employ of the CIA could have expected to domesticate the famously iconoclastic McDonald seemed sheer folly. All these arguments are distractions from the real reason for axing McDonald's article. The anti-Americanism was one thing, but in and of itself, it might perhaps have been tolerated in a diluted form. But McDonald's decision to conclude his attack with a precise of a lengthy article summarizing a report on the behavior of American servicemen captured during the Korean War was a step too far. Extracted by Eugene Kincaid in The New Yorker the previous autumn, the report, commissioned by the U.S. Army, was a damning indictment on the conduct of American prisoners. They often became unmanageable. They refused to obey orders, and they cursed and sometimes struck officers who tried to enforce orders. On winter nights, helpless men with dysentery were rolled outside the huts by their comrades and left to die in the cold. The average American soldier seemed lost without a bottle of pills and a toilet that flushed. 19. Most disturbingly, the report also indicated a high level of collaboration and indoctrination. Amazingly, the Army had made its report public, thus creating a nightmare for government propagandists. Part 20. The inclusion of this data in McDonald's piece was the one good reason why publication in Encounter was guaranteed to be met with an official veto. It was precisely this last part which caused the trouble. And yet, years later, none of those directly involved in dropping McDonald's piece was able to recall the Kincaid issue. I'm not aware that there was any collapse of morale among American soldiers at the end of the Korean War, said Irving Kristol. And if there were, Dwight wouldn't know about it, since what did he know about the Korean War? He sat in New York writing for The New Yorker. He knew nothing about the Korean War. He'd never been to Korea. I don't think he had ever visited a regiment. About military dissatisfaction in the ranks, about that I had heard nothing. I don't remember its being in Dwight McDonald's article at all. 21 likewise, Melvin Lasky, when asked, could remember nothing of this, nor could Stephen Spender, nor could Diana Josselson. This can only be put down to a case of collective historical amnesia. Crystal's memory failure in particular is worth noting. Writing to him in October 1958, by which time the now infamous article had been printed in Dissent, a magazine to the left of Partisan Review, and Crystal had left London to work for the Reporter in New York, Josselson said, "Now, as to his exhibitionist piece about America, which you and Stephen were wrong in accepting in the first place, you may also recall that you asked him to rewrite it and to leave out the whole section about Korea, which had already appeared in The New Yorker. He did not do this." 22 in 1959, Crystal was still embroiled in the Kinkyad controversy and attacked him in person in a televised debate, 23. For this, he earned Josselson's rare approval and a new and avid reader of The Reporter. By axing the MacDonald article, its belated appearance in Tempo Presente, when it had already been published elsewhere, was poor recompense. The credibility of the claim that CIA support came without strings attached was jeopardized. This was all about efforts to create vehicles which by definition were articulators of Western values, of free and open debate, claimed Congress case officer Lee Williams. "We didn't tell them what to do. That would have been inconsistent with the American tradition. This doesn't mean there weren't themes we wanted to see discussed, but we didn't tell them what to do. We did not feed the line to anyone. We believed we should let the facts speak for themselves, let the dialogue go on, let the free voices have a place to express themselves. There was no 'thou shalt think in this way,' 'thou shalt put out this line,' 'thou shalt print this article.' That was totally foreign to what we were doing." 24. William Colby also vigorously challenged the claim that journals like Encounter were expected to perform as dollar megaphones for the CIA. There was not an imposition of control from the CIA, he said. "We were supporting but not bossing, not telling what to do. You might sit down and as good friends you could argue about whether this particular line would make sense of that, but there was no sense of, 'This is it, bang, it comes from Washington, no answers.' No, that goes for Moscow, but it didn't go for Washington." 25. Both the agency and the intellectuals it subsidized have done much to protect this altruistic myth. The MacDonald affair suggests a different reality. The CIA claimed that it was sponsoring freedom of expression. "Of course, that wasn't true," said Jason Epstein. "When Dwight MacDonald wrote his article for Encounter, the editors of the magazine, responding to what they knew to be the Congress's position, refused to publish it. That doesn't say much for promoting freedom of expression. The CIA was promoting a policy and a political line. That was what it was paying for, and that's what it expected to get. Freedom of expression had nothing to do with it." 26. MacDonald himself referred to Nabokov and Josselson as the front office Metternichs of Encounter. "You'd think USA was Venezuela, such touchy national pride," he noted dreely. "Especially nice that the censorship is by a Congress for cultural freedom." 27. American sociologist Norman Birnbaum took up this point in an open letter to the Congress, arguing that the directive excluding the article from Encounter was an unmitigated insolence, and clearly showed that there was a gap between what the Congress preached and what it practiced. The Congress for Cultural Freedom has for some years been lecturing the intelligentsia on the indivisibility of freedom. It's right. Freedom is indivisible. It has to be fought for on issues large and small and extended against 100 dogmatisms and petty tyrannies, not least apparently those of its self-appointed champions. 28. Birnbaum went further, accusing the Congress of submitting liberty to the exigencies of American foreign policy. It seems to subscribe to something very like a Stalinist view of the truth. Truth is whatever serves the interests of the party. 29. The charge that the Congress had dishonored the cause it professed hit hard. Josselson smarted, convinced that the means justified the ends, but deeply troubled by the accusation that the Congress identified truth with the edicts of John Foster Dulles or Allen Welsh Dulles. He skirted the issue entirely when he wrote to explain the whole affair to MacDonald in April 1958 in a letter that was watery and unconvincing. "You must understand that Irving and Stephen must eat, that you must be paid for your articles, that Encounter must be able to say the things that it is best qualified to say without jeopardizing its future." 30 McDonald's response was to say that eliminating irreverent remarks about the American way of life from Encounter because some gray flannel-suited Madison Avenue philanthropoid might cut down on supplies is indeed a miserable business. 31. The duty that no intellectual can shirk without degrading himself is the duty to expose fictions and to refuse to call useful lies truths, Nicola Chiaramonte had announced in the second issue of Encounter. Whilst Encounter never shrank from exposing the useful lies by which communist regimes supported themselves, it was never truly free itself of the bear trap of ideology, of that pervasive Cold War psychology of lying for the truth. By keeping silent on any hot controversial issues, by excessive diplomacy and hush-hush attitude toward all the fakery and shoddiness that's for years been growing so in our whole intellectual atmosphere, 32 Encounter suspended that most precious of Western philosophical concepts, the freedom to think and act independently, and trimmed its sails to suit the prevailing winds. It has been said that a magazine article says what it says, and anyone can examine its arguments and disagree with it. It cannot be a covert performance. 33 Encounter's strange silences, its deliberate concealment of what lay below the bottom line, and its exclusion of material inconvenient to its secret backers, suggests that the contrary is true. As one historian put it, the pertinent question about Encounter's independence was not whether there were instructions cabled to the editors from Washington, but who chose the editors in the first place, and who established the clear bounds of responsible opinion within which differences were uninhibitedly explored. 34. Supporting this argument, Jason Epstein explained that it was not a matter of buying off and subverting individual writers and scholars, but of setting up an arbitrary and factitious system of values by which academic personnel were advanced, magazine editors appointed, and scholars subsidized and published, not necessarily on their merits, though these were sometimes considerable, but because of their allegiance. 35 Josselson had always been very hands-on with Encounter. He drew up the first mock covers, he reviewed and revised contents lists for the early editions, and continued to receive advance notice of its contents from the editors. He reprimanded them when standards dropped, and constantly cajoled them into considering articles or subjects for discussion. Sometimes he sounded as if he was issuing an order. Enclosing a press release on the Congress's Asian Conference to be held in Rangoon in January 1955, he told Kristall simply, "It is essential that this conference be written up in Encounter." 36. Sometimes it was more teasing. I have a New Year's wish, a really first-rate discussion of the problem of coexistence in Encounter. Many of our friends, including Muggeridge and Irving Brown, have the same wish. 37. Or urging Spender to open the literary pages to a new generation of American writers like Saul Bellow, J.D. Salinger, Truman Capote, or Shirley Ann Grau. Or advising Kristall to publish a review of George Padmore's book Pan-Africanism or Communism. I think it is quite important that this book be reviewed in Encounter by one of our people. Point 38. Josselson's approach to Proves was the same, and frequently moved its editor Francois Bondy to resentment. In June 1952, Bondy had actually threatened to resign if the executive committee continued to discuss Proev's policy in his absence and to claim the right to issue editorial instructions. Equally, Josselson did his utmost to protect the magazines from agency interference. But the claim that the axing of MacDonald's piece was unique in the history of Encounter cannot be upheld. If this were true, then one might deduce that the contents of Encounter suited the exigencies of the agency, which subsequently felt it had no need to exercise its veto. One critic described this process as the inevitable relations between employer and employee, in which the wishes of the former become implicit in the acts of the latter. 39. But according to Tom Braden, the agency had meddled at least once before. We had some trouble with Encounter from time to time, and I used to say, let them publish what they want. But there was one time, it was over some question of foreign policy, and Larry Dunfield sent me a query about an article, and we had to veto it. I think it had to do with U.S. policy toward China. Encounter was to publish a piece that was critical of U.S. policy, and we had a hell of a fight back at the office. I remember going up and talking to Alan Dulles, and he refused to get involved. He just said, You handle it. So we finally axed it, and I am sorry we axed it. 40 Monty Woodhouse, who was liaising with de Neufville at this time, was well aware that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was axing pieces. But I never knew of any formal guidelines for this, which were precisely laid down anywhere. 41. Woodhouse could not recall whether or not Leslie Fiedler's article on the Rosenbergs was seen by members of the intelligence community before publication, but it seems likely that such a controversial intervention in an area of critical importance to the U.S. government would have commanded the CIA's attention. The article to which Braden referred appeared on Josleson's desk on the 28th of July 1954, sent to him from London by Spender. The essay was by Emily Hahn, an eccentric contributor to The New Yorker, an undisputed expert on China. She had lived in Hong Kong during the 1930s and 1940s and had insisted on taking Joseph Alsop to an opium den when he visited in 1941. Both found themselves interned in the same Hong Kong camp after the Japanese invasion of 1942. Josselson wrote by return that he found it utterly shocking. It will certainly not make any new friends in England. I am passing it on to Nicholas and Francois, and shall call you or Irving about it before this letter reaches you. 2 days later, Nabokov wrote to Crystal and Spender. Before going into the matter of Miss Emily Hahn's piece, let me restate some of the principles upon which we had all agreed in the course of the talks we had at the time of launching Encounter, as well as in our various subsequent meetings. We agreed that all articles on controversial topics should be seen by us before they are shown to anybody outside. We agreed that one of the fundamental policies of Encounter should be to work towards a better understanding between England and America, and consequently, that all political issues should be discussed on the highest possible plane so that whenever controversy takes place, it should be stated in a manner as not to be offensive to national feelings on either side of the ocean. We have all read Miss Hahn's piece. All of us had the same negative reaction to this article. We feel that Miss Hahn gives an erroneous, superficial, and slipshod statement of the American point of view on China. We feel that Miss Hahn's article is offensive in matters of style, temper, and contents. Bondi concurred with Nabokov, saying the piece was full of hysterical abuse. After pointing out what this hysterical abuse was, Nabokov asked, "Now, where do we go from here? We would suggest that you should attempt to secure from Miss Hahn a rewrite of her article, which would result in a complete change of tone, eliminating its most abusive passages. In addition to Miss Hahn, you secure another article stating the American point of view on the Chinese problem, but on a high and dignified level and in a more concise form. If this cannot be done, we think that Miss Hahn's article should be dropped, and this crucial issue raised again at a later date, with more responsible persons than Miss Hahn representing the American point of view." In case this admonition wasn't enough, on the 19th of August, the newly installed Deputy Secretary of the Congress, CIA agent Warren Manschel, stepped forward with a raft of suggested amendments to the piece. "We are all in agreement here that it would be unwise to publish the piece," he wrote. "If your commitments are irreversible, however, and the article has to appear, then the following sections will have to be changed as a minimum condition of its publication." There followed an exhaustive list of the sections in question, with detailed notes in Manschel's hand. But still, he urged the editors to reconsider, warning them that the Hahn may well cook our goose. The article never appeared. The reasons for its exclusion, which were withheld from Encounter's readers and contributors, lend credence to the later charge that, in the magazine, where a truth was uncomfortable for the Soviet Union, it is promulgated. Where it is uncomfortable for the United States, it is mitigated. 45.